The guards burst into the smithy at night. The door was ajar, and only a lamp by the anvil was lit inside. They shouted, "Stop!" The man dropped his hammer, and the woman screamed, her hands trembling. One of the guards stepped forward and grabbed her by the elbow. She broke free and fell to her knees. The blacksmith stood between them, his voice low. "Let her go. She left of her own accord." The guard spat in his face. "A feudal lord's wife in a smithy at this hour is none of your business, man. Follow us." She raised her head and looked at the blacksmith. There was more fear than surprise in her eyes. The blacksmith took another step forward. "She will not go," he said quietly. The guard slapped him across the cheek. She sobbed, reached for his hand, but the guards dragged her away and took her to the castle. One of them turned around and whispered, "The feudal lord will punish anyone who dares to touch his wife." The blacksmith fell to his knees by the anvil and covered his eyes with his hands. The lamp shook with his breathing. After the guards left, the blacksmith remained alone in the smithy. He sat down on a stool and sat there silently for a long time. Then he picked up his hammer and began to work, but his movements were slow and imprecise. He knew that everything had changed today. He knew that now people looked at him differently, even if no one had said anything directly. His hands trembled so much that he almost pricked himself. He put down the hammer and went to wash his hands in a jug of warm water. The water was warm, but it did not cool his heart. Her name was Maria. She came to the smithy for small things, to repair a buckle, reinforce a knife, order a horseshoe for an old dog. The first time she approached the counter, it seemed accidental. She stood in the doorway and looked at the blacksmith, while he continued to forge. She asked, "Can you fix this lock?" He replied, "Yes, I can. Bring it tomorrow." She brought the lock, then something else. At first, it was all business, things, work, payment. But each time they lingered in conversation. She spoke softly, sometimes laughed, and then the blacksmith's chest would expand and he would smile, even though the words were simple. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" She talked about the house, about little things, about the household. He talked about iron, about orders, about time. He didn't know how to speak beautifully. It was easier for him to do things, to forge, to repair. She talked and looked at her hands, as if there was some kind of truth there. One evening, when she came to bring him the ring he had polished, she paused at the door and said, "Have you never left this land?" He said, "Why leave? My work is here, my people are here, my home is here." She lowered her eyes and sighed. "Sometimes I feel like I'm in a cage here too." He only said, "A smithy is not a cage. A smithy is honest. What you see is what you get." She looked at him and suddenly touched his hand. He froze, didn't take a step, didn't pull his hand away. She took off her scarf and ran it over his palm, where there was a scar from an old burn. "You often hurt yourself," she said. He smiled crookedly. "I'm used to it." She sat down on the bench and remained silent for a long time, without removing her hand. They stood side by side, and no one said anything. They gave more to this silence than to words. The feudal lord, her husband, was older, considered wealthy and stern. He rarely visited the smithy, but he was found where he needed to show his power. On the hunt, at council with his vassals. Maria knew the rules of the court. She knew that her smiles were controlled. She knew that even a casual glance could be grounds for punishment. But she came to the blacksmith more and more often, not out of necessity, but to stay for a few minutes. She brought wine for her father, brought jewelry for him to fix the clasp, brought silent requests. She waited until he finished his work and left the smithy with a different expression on her face, as if something had changed inside her. They spoke more quietly and less often. He learned to guess when she was having a hard time and when she could smile. Once she asked directly, "Do you know what will happen if someone finds out?" He replied, "I know. I know the price. I know what I'm facing." She said, "I know too. And I still come." He placed a small knife he had made for her in the mirror and said, "If you don't leave, I'll have to leave first." She looked at him, not understanding at first, then suddenly nodded and whispered, "I won't leave." The night of the ball came a few weeks later. The castle was noisy with guests, music and dancing. She dressed differently than usual. Not flashy, but as if for another life. She approached the door of the smithy and knocked. He opened it quietly, not expecting to see her there on such a night. She entered, took off her cloak and looked at the anvil. "He's drunk tonight," she said. "He always drinks at balls," he replied. She lowered her eyes and came closer. She took him by the sleeve and watched him hold the hammer. "I won't be long," she said. He said, "Stay if you want." She sat down on the bench by the stove and took the pin out of her hair. He didn't say a word, just finished his work and put down the hammer. They sat side by side. She looked at him and suddenly said, "If I were free." He did not have time to answer. She suddenly leaned against him and touched his cheek with her lips. He froze, then leaned over and kissed her lips gently, as if testing metal. She did not pull away. They kissed again, and it was a long kiss. No sound penetrated the smithy except their breathing. Then she whispered, "Don't tell anyone." He replied, "I won't." She rested her head on his shoulder, as if she could hide there. He put his arm around her neck and held her closer. They sat like that for a long time, until the lamp began to smoke. That night, they didn't want to think about the consequences. They talked about simple things: her childhood, his teacher, village festivals. They spoke in hushed tones, as if their lives depended on it. She talked about how she sat at the dinner table and watched her husband eating loudly. She said, "Sometimes I want to yell at him, but then he looks at me like that." She didn't finish. He said, "Is there anything I can do to make it easier for you?" She looked at his hands and said, "Make me a ring. Not to wear, just to know that you made it for me." He made a ring from an old nail. At night, when the guests had left, she put the ring on her finger and said, "Now I'll sit down at the table again, and I'll have your work on my finger." His hand trembled as he took the ring off the anvil and gave it to her. She put it in her pocket and pressed it with her palm, then looked at the door and stood up. "Go," she said quietly. He raised the hammer but did not strike. She left into the dark night, and he remained alone in the forge, holding an old piece of iron that had once been a nail. Since then, they had seen each other at night. Sometimes she came after leaving the ball. Sometimes she came just like that, saying she needed to pick something up from the farm. They tried not to make any noise, but their conversations were full of meaning. She asked, "Aren't you afraid?" He replied, "Fear is quiet. I'm afraid when I hear footsteps at the door." She laughed through her tears. "You're right. Footsteps always mean the end." They held each other's hands as they walked to the door, as if that touch could protect them. But fear was always there. Every time she returned to the castle, she looked different. Sometimes she thought her husband noticed the changes in her. He began to look at her longer, asking questions about where she had been. She answered briefly, "At a friend's, at church, with my family." He looked at her and said nothing. Once, when she went into her room in the evening, she saw a lipstick mark on the pillow. She picked it up and pressed it to her lips, then threw it into the fire. Her husband asked, "Have you lost something?" She opened her mouth but did not tell the truth. They kept up appearances at home, but the tension was growing. The blacksmith knew that sooner or later someone would notice. He knew the price of such nights, but he could not stop. He loved her simply and without pretension. She responded in kind. Sometimes they looked at each other in silence and cried without restraint. Their tears were not a cry, but an admission that they understood their hopeless situation. He came to her door earlier than he needed to. She left later than usual. They were increasingly afraid of footsteps in the corridor and whispers on the stairs. One evening, when her husband came home early and entered the bedroom, she lay quietly, but he stood up and looked at her for a long time. She sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing. He asked, "Are you afraid of something?" She replied briefly, "I'm cold." He came over, took her by the shoulders, looked her in the face and said, "If anyone dares to laugh at my house, I know how to punish them." She nodded and did not argue. He let go of her shoulders and sat down at the table. The blacksmith stood in the smithy and thought about the ring. He bent over the iron, but his thoughts distracted him. He was afraid that someone remembered how she stood at the door that night. He was afraid that someone would say a word that would destroy everything. He thought about the truth. He was only married to his work. He had no family. He had a few neighbors with whom he drank on holidays. He had old trousers and a shirt. But now he also had a feeling that had nothing to do with metal. He loved her. He did not hide this from himself. He understood the price of such a feeling, but he could not give it up. A few days later, rumors spread through the village. Someone had seen her late at night at the gate. Someone had heard a voice behind the door. The rumors reached the feudal lord's ears, and he began to look at her differently. He began to come home late, but he came home with rudeness. Once he stopped her in the courtyard and asked, "Where did you go that night?" She replied, "I went to church." He said, "The church is not closed all night." She said, "I did not sleep." He looked at her as one looks at an object that is in the way. She bowed and left without asking his forgiveness. It was not forgiveness, it was patience. The blacksmith began to notice that she was not the only one who came to him. One of the feudal lord's servants came to him. He looked calm, but there was a lot of trembling in his eyes. "The master asks you to do something special. Come to the castle tomorrow." He gave money. The blacksmith thought it was a normal order. In the castle, he saw things that were not found in the village. Clean tables, heavy chests, people with short haircuts who did not smile. He was taken to a workshop near the castle, where other craftsmen were working. The feudal lord had a face that never changed. The feudal lord said, "I need a cage. Small, but strong. For a predator. I want it done quickly." The blacksmith took measurements and measured out the iron. He heard the feudal lord say to someone nearby, "I have entrusted this work to you personally. Don't let me down." The room was cold from the dryness of the words. The blacksmith realized that this was not just an order. He asked, "Who is the cage for?" The feudal lord looked straight at him and said, "That's my business. Do your job and don't meddle in other people's affairs." The blacksmith bit his lip and nodded. He thought about her, and how her husband had asked for the cage to be made. He wanted to refuse, but he couldn't. A suspicion arose in his mind, but he did not say a word. He thought, if it's a cage for an animal, why the secrecy? At night, when the blacksmith returned home, he saw people whispering and looking towards the castle. Someone said that the feudal lord was preparing punishment for any betrayal. The blacksmith realized that he couldn't leave things as they were. He came to her the next day when she was hiding a piece of bread in the kitchen. She started when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," he said. They sat down at the table, and he said bluntly, "He's asking me to make a cage. I think it's for someone." She lowered her eyes and did not answer. His hand was resting on the table. She reached out and touched his fingers. "Maybe for a beast," she whispered. He looked at her lips and said, "If that's the case, we need to think about where to run." She looked at him intently and asked, "Where can we go? I don't know of any place where I would be free." He said, "I can go anywhere. But you?" She took his hand and said, "I can't take the house and the children. I can't just leave in the middle of the night." He listened, and his heart ached. They began to decide otherwise, not to run, but to wait for the moment. They thought that if no one found out, everything would continue as before. But patience is also a risk. They hid their meetings in silence, talked about trifles, but the feudal lord became more cunning. He ordered the guards to wait at the gate and watch the courtiers. He told the servants to report any unusual movements. He kept a watchful eye on the courtyard, giving them no chance. Maria came to the smithy less often, and each time she left with a pale face. She began to laugh more quietly. The blacksmith noticed this and asked, "What's wrong?" She said, "He asked me today if I was cheating on him. I said no." He said, "And he believed you?" She pressed her lips tightly together and replied, "He looks longer than before." One morning, a boy who helped in the village came to the blacksmith. He stood at the door and said, "They're calling for you in the courtyard." The blacksmith went and saw that everyone was looking at him. The guard led him into the castle and said, "The lord is waiting." People were gathered in the hall. The feudal lord stood up and asked, "Do you know how much I owe you?" The blacksmith shook his head. The feudal lord said, "You do a lot of blacksmithing for me, but I want to see your loyalty." He took a hammer in his hands and struck a forged ring that looked like a meaningless object. He said, "Do you see this? It is for a bird. It will sit in it and sing. Only I decide who sings." The blacksmith listened and could not understand what his words meant. After everyone had left, the feudal lord approached him and whispered in his ear, "Make the cage well, and if you don't, I'll burn down your smithy." The blacksmith felt a chill in his palms, but said, "I will do as I am told." A feeling burned in his chest like coals. He knew that his fate was tied to the iron he would create. He understood that iron could also become his prison. He and Maria looked at each other and remained silent, almost unable to speak. She raised her hand and ran her fingers across his cheek. "Be careful," she said. He nodded and looked down. At night he forged the cage. He made each bar smooth and strong. He understood that he was not just fulfilling an order, but creating something that could be used against him. He thought about how to twist the fastenings, how to weaken the lock, so that he himself would not fall into the trap. But the feudal lord was watching, and he had no right to show weakness. When the cage was ready, the blacksmith hid one detail, a thin wire inside the beam, and told himself that this was a chance, small and dangerous. He didn't tell Maria. He couldn't tell her. In the morning, the feudal lord took the cage to his dungeon and said to the blacksmith, "I'll pick it up in a week. I'll call you." The blacksmith nodded. He returned to the smithy and sat down at the table. His hands were black with soot, and he looked at his palms. He understood that they had made their choice. He understood that the time for thinking was over. In the evening, Maria came and stood frozen at the threshold. She approached and said, "He's preparing something. I heard him." He took her hand and said, "We need to act." She looked at him, and determination appeared in her eyes. "How?" she asked. He looked silently into her eyes and said, "I don't know, but I don't want you to suffer." She nodded and pressed her palm against his. They sat in silence, listening to the birds being scared away in the smithy outside. They sat in the smithy and spoke quietly. He said bluntly, "If he decides to, we won't be able to withstand the onslaught of his men. We need to think about how to leave with the children, or how to keep them safe." She lowered her gaze and clasped her hands together. "I can't take the children away," she said. "They are mine. You can't leave them. They will be watched by the servants, and my children cannot withstand the vagabonds." He sat down next to her and took her hand. "Then I will think of another way. I will make sure that the cage does not become a trap for us." She looked at him and asked, "How?" He told her what he had hidden in the cage. "I put a thin wire in one of the beams," he said. "I did it so that when the load shifts, it can break if it's released. But it's a risk. If they find it, I'll pay with my life." She didn't pull away. "I'm not afraid of your death," she whispered. He squeezed her hand tighter. "I'm only afraid for you," he replied. "They thought about escaping." She said, "If we leave, where will we go? Who will take us in? I don't know anyone who will help us." He said, "I can leave on my own. I can find work somewhere else. But I can't take you with me and leave the children." She listened and remained silent. Sometimes she would close her eyes and cry quietly, but then immediately force herself to appear calm. They agreed. He would do everything he could to keep the possibility of escape open, and at the same time try to weaken the lock, so that they could escape if the worst happened. The days passed. They saw each other less often. Every time she returned home, she tried to look as if she had been visiting friends. Her husband became more attentive. He made the servants report everything. One evening, one of the young servants came into the smithy and asked the blacksmith about new bars. The blacksmith pretended to be glad to see the guest and said, "Do you need a couple more strands for the gate?" The boy nodded and left. A few hours later, the same servant approached the feudal lord and said, "The blacksmith put something strange in that cage. I saw him fiddling with it for a long time." The feudal lord looked and said nothing at first. He got up and left the room. He spoke quietly to the servant. "Keep an eye on him. If you hear anything, report it." Rumors spread quickly. In the feudal lord's house, people looked at each other in a new way. Maria noticed that one of the old maids began to look at her more intently. One night, as she was putting the children to bed, the maid entered quietly and said, "Madam, the master said not to leave the house without permission." Maria nodded and closed the door. When she met the blacksmith the next day, she was quieter than usual. "Has he found out?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet. But he's listening. He's waiting. He said, I'll go to the castle tomorrow. They've asked me to check the lock. I'll look at the bars and check the fastenings. She grabbed his arm. Don't go, if you can help it. If they catch you, it's all over. He looked at her and said, if I don't go, he'll be suspicious. If I go and look hostile, he'll be suspicious. There's no good way. She let go of his hand. The next day, he went to the castle. He was told that an old grate needed to be repaired. The workshop at the castle was hot and crowded. The feudal lord looked at him but said nothing. The blacksmith worked in silence. When he finished, the feudal lord approached him and said, You work well. I appreciate craftsmen. His voice was even without warmth. The blacksmith nodded. The feudal lord led him out into the corridor and said, I want another favor. Prepare that cage for me. I'll take it myself. The blacksmith felt his throat tighten. He spoke calmly. What for? For a bird. The feudal lord smiled. You are too curious, blacksmith. Do your job and don't ask questions. The blacksmith returned to the smithy and felt a heaviness. He realized he was being watched. He decided to act differently. That night, he did not lock all the bolts as usual. He left one door slightly ajar. It was a risk, but he thought that if necessary, he could quickly run out and hide with a friend in another village. The next day, Maria came and said, He asked me directly why your hands were covered in soot. He said, You spend a lot of time at the blacksmith's. I replied that he helped us with the horseshoe. She closed her eyes and added, He looked at me as if he wanted to say something more. She did not mention that he kept the ring in his pocket. She did not mention that she sometimes looked out the window when he left the house and wondered if she could leave forever. The servants in the castle began to gather and whisper. One morning, 2 guards approached the smithy and said, The Lord asks you to come to the hall. Immediately, the blacksmith pretended not to be worried and went. The feudal lord was standing in the hall. Around him were 2 old men from the council and several warriors. He rose from his chair and said, I want you to do one more thing. This will be your last job for me. You will do it well. And you will come with me to the basement. The blacksmith looked him straight in the eye and asked, Why? The feudal lord replied quietly, Don't ask questions. Just do it. His voice was short, like an order. He was told to go to the basement. The cage was already there. The light was dim, and only footsteps could be heard. The feudal lord approached and said, Look at her, blacksmith. She is your work. Praise it. Tell it you're satisfied. The blacksmith touched the bars. He felt his heart pounding in his chest. The metal was cold. He wanted to smile, but couldn't. The feudal lord said, You made it strong. I am satisfied. The blacksmith nodded. Then one of the senior servants appeared in the doorway and said, Sir, we found a ring on the maid. A small mark on her finger. What should we do? The feudal lord turned and said quietly, So all the answers are close at hand. He looked at the blacksmith and added, Bring her in. The blacksmith heard something inside him snap. He took a step, but his hands were shaking. At that moment, the door opened and Maria was brought into the hall. She walked, holding the maid's hand, and looked around. When she saw the blacksmith, her face turned pale. She whispered, What are they doing? The blacksmith did not answer. The feudal lord stood up and said, You were both seen. I want to hear the truth. Which one of you is lying? They stood side by side. There were many people in the hall. The blacksmith felt eyes staring at them both. He lowered his head. Maria looked at her husband and said quietly, I didn't do anything, but her voice trembled. The feudal lord put his hand on the table and said, I will decide who is telling the truth. You will both remain silent until I decide. In the meantime, guards. 2 men approached and grabbed them by the arms. The blacksmith saw Maria looking at him, and there was something in her gaze that he could not understand. They led them into separate rooms. He heard her footsteps receding and stood silently until the door slammed shut. He heard the door slam shut. The room was dark, but the torchlight fell on the wall. Through the crack in the door, he could hear footsteps in the corridor. Gradually, the footsteps receded, leaving him time to think. He sat down on a bench and buried his face in his hands. His hands were covered in blood and soot. He thought about her, about the children, about what the feudal lord had said. Somewhere below, the castle rumbled. His weakness seemed like betrayal to him. The door flew open, and one of the servants ran into the room. He said quickly, "The master has ordered a trial at dawn tomorrow. People will gather. He wants everything to be public. You will be brought to the center and tell the truth." The blacksmith looked at him and asked, "What truth?" The servant lowered his eyes. "He said you were unfaithful to her. He said he saw the ring." The blacksmith did not answer. The servant fell silent and added, "If you want to say something to her, you can meet her tomorrow before the trial." Then he disappeared. In another room, Maria sat on a low bench and wiped away her tears. The maid held a little boy who had started crying and was now quietly sobbing. Voices could be heard in the hall. An old man from the feudal lord's council approached Maria. He said, "If you confess, perhaps the punishment will be lighter. If not, the Lord will decide." Maria raised her head. She looked at the old man, then at the maid, and her face showed a determination that he had rarely seen before. She said quietly, "I will not tell a lie to save myself." The old man sighed and left. Maria hugged the child close and began to cry. She thought about how to explain to the children if something happened. She thought about what to do next, but could not find an answer. Morning came quickly. People gathered in the courtyard. Servants, peasants, several noble neighbors. The feudal lord stood on a platform, his face pale. He looked at the people and said calmly, "Who has the right to judge? I have the right, but the people must see order." His voice was even, unhurried. When the blacksmith was brought in, everyone fell silent. He walked calmly, without making any unnecessary movements. His hands were tied behind his back. When Maria was brought in, she walked slowly, and the children held on to her skirt and looked around with wide eyes. The blacksmith saw them and felt something cut inside him. The feudal lord turned to them and said, "I have found proof. The ring found on the maid is yours. You too lied in your statements. What do you have to say?" Maria looked at the children and said quietly, "I am guilty." Her voice did not tremble, but there was weariness in it. The blacksmith heard this and thought that she had given herself up to stop everything. He wanted to shout, to refuse, but the guards pushed him forward. The feudal lord said, "If you confess, there will be punishment. I will decide." Then he smiled briefly. "But I want to see the traitor pay. I want the blacksmith to make his own punishment." His words sounded like a sentence. After the trial, the blacksmith was taken back to his workshop at the castle. There stood the cage he had made. It stood in the middle of the floor, and the craftsmen's people crowded around it. The feudal lord approached the blacksmith and said quietly, almost calmly, "You know how to forge strong. I want you to make it perfect. Make it so that no one can get out. Make it for me, with your own blow." The blacksmith looked him straight in the eye and said, "I will not make shackles for myself." The feudal lord smiled. "You have heard the verdict. Either you finish it and sit in it, or I will let someone else finish it, and then you will die in prison. The choice is yours, blacksmith." The blacksmith swallowed wearily. He understood that he had no choice. He accepted silently. He picked up his hammer and returned to the anvil. People watched, and the rustling of clothes and whispers could be heard. He worked quickly and smoothly as always, but inside he felt empty. He remembered how he once took her hand and heard her laugh. He remembered the night of the ball, and the ring he made from a nail. As he forged the bars, his thoughts raced in different directions. He thought about how he could save the children, how he could disappear, how he could hide the small detail he had hidden before. He thought about the thin wire he had inserted into the beam, about the smallest chance. Now he had to make sure the feudal lord didn't notice. He tried to reinforce the spot, so that the wire would look like a normal plank. He hid the traces of the wire with his hands and did the work carefully. When the cage was almost ready, the feudal lord came over and examined it. He tapped on the bars and listened to the sound. He took a corner and looked inside. The blacksmith stood nearby and remained silent. The feudal lord looked at him and said, "You will put the lock on yourself. I want to see you lock yourself in. And when you stand in the cage, I will close it and hang it in the square." His voice was even. Everyone looked at the blacksmith. The blacksmith raised his hand, took the key, and silently approached the cage. He looked at Maria, who was standing in the crowd. She was holding a child and looking at him as if she did not understand what was happening. When he entered the cage, her fingers grabbed the edge, and he saw her lips trembling. She looked at her husband. The feudal lord calmly signaled to the guards. The blacksmith stood up inside, and the guard closed the door. The sturdy lock clicked. Maria rushed forward and cried, "No, don't lock him in." She struggled towards the cage, but the guards pushed her away. She fell to her knees and grabbed the bars, banging on the grate and screaming, "Elite! I said I was guilty." Her voice broke, and the children's cries could be heard nearby. The feudal lord watched and said calmly, "A lie is a lie. She confessed herself. I am punishing her for treason and for bringing shame upon my house." Then he stood up and turned to the people. "Put the cage in the square for all to see." The crowd murmured, and the guards lifted the cage. The blacksmith saw them place the cage on a wooden platform in the center of the town. The sun had not yet risen high, but the light fell on the metal. He stood, squeezed between the bars, and listened. Maria stood nearby, tears streaming from her eyes. The children cried quietly. He looked at her for a long time, trying to say something, but his voice betrayed him. Fragments of conversations came to his mind, her light touch on his hand, her whisper, "I won't leave." Now he understood bitterly that she couldn't leave the children and the house. He jerked his hand. The iron shook, but the lock was strong. He remembered the wire. His heart sank. He wanted to try to break free, but he knew that if the feudal lord noticed, the punishment would be immediate and terrible. The crowd watched. Some whispered, some spat. Maria stood by the platform, her hands clenched into fists. She looked up and met his gaze. He tried to smile so that she would understand. He did not want her to suffer. His hand grabbed the bar and he said quietly, "I love you." Her lips trembled. She closed her eyes and replied softly, "I know." Then she fell to her knees and covered her face with her hands. The day dragged on. People came and went. The blacksmith sat in his cage and looked at the house, at the window where the children might be. At one point, the feudal lord approached the platform and said loudly, "Let this lesson be an example to all. No one dares to disgrace my house." He turned and left. The blacksmith heard words from the crowd. "He will sit there forever. They will cut off his bread. They will leave him water, but he will not come out." No one raised a hand to help him. At night, Maria stood alone by the cage. The maids had closed the windows, and the children were asleep. She whispered, holding her palm to the bars. The blacksmith heard her whispers, heard her reproachful voice to herself. If only I," she spoke and cried, and there was so much guilt in her voice that it seemed as if his heart was squeezing even tighter. He could do nothing but look at her and wait. Days passed. The blacksmith saw the children sometimes come up to the cage and look at him. They did not understand everything, but they sensed that something was broken. Maria came every day. She passed him bread through the bars. She tried to leave notes, but the guards were watching. Sometimes she stood and said nothing for hours. She didn't demand that he escape, she didn't scream, she didn't beg for mercy. She was just there. There was pain and regret in her eyes. One night, when the guards were drinking in the tavern and the crowd was sparse, the thin wire he had hidden earlier appeared in the smithy. It was intact, but it was not strong enough to break the lock. He touched the wire with his hands through the bars, and it trembled. He realized he would not be able to escape. The wire was thin and more of a symbol than a real hope. This knowledge killed the last of his hope. He bowed his head and whispered into the darkness, "Goodbye." Maria was standing by the cage and heard him. She hugged her children close and cried. That night, he was the first to fall asleep. His sleep was brief. In the morning, the crowd gathered again, but no longer with intense interest, but with the habit of looking at the man in the cage as one looks at a monument. Maria got up early and stood by the cage for a long time. Then, unable to look, she left and returned with a basket. She put bread in it and silently left it at the foot of the platform. She looked into the blacksmith's eyes, and their gazes met in a brief silence. He nodded. She wiped her face and left. Weeks passed. People gradually stopped coming, but Maria did not leave. She fed him and spoke to him quietly when she could. He heard her voice, and it sustained him more than food. He understood that her confession at the trial had saved the children, but he also understood the price of that salvation. That price was his freedom. He thought that he had done everything possible to help her so that she could go on living, but that did not bring his life back. One morning, a guard came with an order. He said briefly, "The Lord has ordered the cage to be removed. The blacksmith must be taken to the dungeon." Maria fell to her knees and grabbed the bars, begging, "No, don't take him away." The guard pushed her away. She cried out and grabbed the child. Her legs were shaking, and there was despair in her voice. The blacksmith looked and understood. His days in the square were over, but that did not mean the end of his suffering. They took him away. He turned and looked one last time at the house where she remained. He read farewell and love on her face and knew that everything he had done was for her and for the children. The guards led him deep into the castle. The stone walls were cold and damp, smelling of mold and decay. His footsteps echoed, and the chains jangled on his wrists. No one said a word, only the occasional command. "This way, further." It was dark in the dungeon. He was thrown into a cell, and the heavy door was closed. Inside was a clay bowl of water and a piece of stale bread. He sat down on a stone and stared at the wall for a long time, thinking of nothing. The next day he was let out again. People from the council were already waiting in the hall. The feudal lord sat on a raised platform. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed fatigue and hidden anger. He said loudly, "This man is a traitor. He has disgraced my house. He will remain in prison for the rest of his days. That is my decision." The people began to murmur. Some nodded, some remained silent. No one dared to object. Maria stood aside. Her face was pale, her eyes red. She did not look at her husband, only at the blacksmith. When he was taken away again, she quietly followed the guards and asked, "Let me talk to him." The servant hesitated, but then nodded. "At night, when the master is asleep, I will bring you to him." At night, the cell door opened and the light of a torch shone through the crack. Mary entered. She was wearing a dark cloak, her face covered by a hood. When she took it off, the blacksmith saw how much she had changed. Her cheeks were sunken, her eyes full of pain. She approached him and took his hands. Her voice trembled. "Forgive me. I couldn't protect you. I was afraid for the children. I said what they wanted to hear." He looked at her and shook his head. "You did the right thing. The children must live. You must live." She cried and pressed herself against his chest. "I can't live without you. I think about you every night. I remember everything that happened. Those days in the smithy, your hands, your voice. I feel like I'm going crazy." He hugged her tightly. "Don't cry. You have to be strong. You need them. And I'm not getting out of here." She looked up. "I'll help you. I'll figure out how to get you out of here. I'll sell everything I have. I'll find people." He smiled gently. "Don't. It will only make things worse. They'll kill you. Take the children away. Live. Let the children grow up. Let them remember that their mother was strong. And I'll stay here." She fell silent, her hands trembling. Then she slowly took a small knife from under her cloak. "If we can't be together there, let's be together here." She held out the knife to him. He looked at her long and hard. Then he took the knife and placed it on the stone next to him. "No, you won't do that. You must live for them. I am already lost. But don't you dare ruin the children." She covered her face with her hands and cried for a long time. Then she knelt down and whispered, "I love you. I always have." He lifted her face and said quietly, "Me too. And that won't change, even if I die here." They sat together until the torch began to fade. When the door opened, she took her hands away and quietly left. Before leaving, she turned around once more. He looked at her and memorized her gaze. It was their last meeting. Weeks passed. Maria no longer came. Her husband ordered her to be kept under surveillance. She tried to write notes, but the guards intercepted them. She was going crazy because she couldn't see him. Rumors began to spread in the city that the lady was growing pale and wasting away before their eyes. The blacksmith sat in his cell, losing strength day by day. He no longer waited. He only remembered. He dreamed of her eyes, her hands. Sometimes he heard children's laughter behind the walls, and then he covered his face with his hands and remained silent, so as not to cry out. A few months later, he was found in the morning not breathing. He was lying on a stone, his eyes closed, his hands folded on his chest. No one knew what he had died of: hunger, illness, or simply because he had stopped fighting. When Maria found out, she fainted. She did not get out of bed for several days. Then she went out to the children and said, "Your father was a good man. Remember that. Do not listen to what people say." She never smiled again. The feudal lord ordered the blacksmith to be buried without honors, outside the city walls. Maria secretly went there at night and left a ring on his grave, the very one he had once made from a nail. She knelt down and sat in silence for a long time. From then on, she lived only for her children. Her life became empty and cold. But every night, when she closed her eyes, she felt as if she were sitting in the smithy again, hearing the ringing of the hammer and feeling warm hands on her palm. And then she whispered into the darkness, "I love you, and I will always love you."